have a little bit more to your backstory, please. Again, can you tell I have a pet peeve about class structures? Good day and welcome. My name is Caitlin, and here on this channel I teach old-fashioned sewing skills and make reproduction clothing. If you're a regular viewer, thank you so much for coming back for another video. This one's going to be a little bit different than we've done before, but I'm hoping y'all like this. And if so, we're going to make it somewhat a normal thing on this channel, maybe every other month or so. And if you're new here, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. If anything such as dressmaking, historical sewing, costuming, living history, wardrobes, anything of that nature sounds interesting to you, I'd appreciate if you click that subscribe button and join us every week. We have videos twice a week, mostly on historical sewing. So I am a professional seamstress and I have been sewing for over 20 years. Doing historical sewing for, do we count real historic sewing, as in like me knowing what I'm doing and actually looking at original garments and trying to copy them, probably 13 or 14 years. I do technically have in the back room I've always been interested in historical costuming, but like when I was like 9 or 10 I made costumes and I actually have one of them in the other room, so we don't count anything before I actually attempted to do it right. But yeah, there is that as well. I also used to work in a museum and I do collect original garments. I'm not a huge collector and I don't have a lot, but I have pieces that I share on the channel that I copy exactly. I also have friends with huge collections who share with me, and I enjoy looking through their collections as well, and that's a great privilege that I get to learn how things were done in the 19th century so that I can then come and recreate them myself. So today I have some tea and we're just going to sit and talk instead of doing any sewing today. And we're going to delve into a little bit of research project that has been on my mind lately. It was brought to a head by a comment I received on a recent video about 19th century dresses being better than modern dresses. The comments on that video actually kind of took me aback a little bit. It was the first one of my videos that got several thousand views, and I think a lot of people were watching that who aren't normal subscribers, if that makes sense. And so like my more regular subscribers are typically living historians, people interested in historical costuming, in old clothing, or in old sewing techniques. And a lot of them have watched several of my videos and understand a lot about the 19th century, more than your average person at least, even they're brand new to living history. You tend to understand a little bit more than your average person. So some of those comments, they're not normally the type of comments I receive on videos. But then I realized that these aren't people who are subscribed. This just pops up in your feed because the short little videos are a lot easier to watch and a lot more people are watching them than the longer videos. But this comment in particular was interesting to me because it had a lot of myths in it that was being spoken about as if they were true. And I did request for more information, more documentation from the poster. In my response, received absolutely nothing. So I think that tells us a lot. People like to spout historical fiction as fact because a lot of people think they know a lot about history, when in fact it may be true for a particular time period or a particular era or place. But a lot of people like to take all their little history facts and put them in what I call the history blender. So they just take little pieces of paper with all the little information and they put it in a blender and it blends everything up, and all of a sudden everything applies to every single era, which of course is not true. There is no one size fits all in any time frame, in any culture. But a lot of people who talk about history like to pretend that it is. And this comment kind of set ahead to that and again spouted a lot of untruths. So we're going to kind of talk about it today. These are some myths that I have heard over and over and over again. And I figured that if I'm hearing them over and over again, then surely other people are as well. So let's go ahead and bust some myths. And just as a reminder, on this channel, we don't do conjecture. We do not do again, the history blender idea. We don't do, well, my grandmother said that this was back when her grandmother was alive, they did this, or this is just something I picked up over the years, or I've always heard that, or it's just logical that. We don't do any of that. We deal with primary documentation here. So sources from the 19th century written by the people who are wearing these clothes. Those are the sources we're going to. We are not doing any modern conjecture. Also, I don't consider myself an expert in 19th and 20th century fashion. Or even dressmaking for that matter. I do not have a master's degree. My bachelor's is in elementary education. I teach 6-year-olds, okay? Taught 6-year-olds for 8 years. I am not an expert. I just like old things. I collect old things. I have a decent attention to detail. I like solving puzzles and figuring out how things were done. I kind of have a mechanical mind that way. And I'm also kind of a perfectionist, so I like to do things the right way. And that includes with historical sewing. I also love history, so that kind of just all meshes into why we're here today. I'm seriously just a woman who likes old clothes, has a decent attention to detail, and has always been into historical costuming, and who has been sewing since she was 8 years old, and took an American Girl Felicity class in the homeschool co-op on Mondays, where I learned to dance and curtsy properly and did a sampler. And yeah, that's when all this started. So I know so many people whose knowledge vastly supersedes my own. I mean, I'm again not an expert in any of this, but I do have a platform here on YouTube, so we're gonna talk. And now that we've got the disclaimer out of the way, let's bust some myths. So today I've only picked up 3 myths that we're gonna talk about. I actually picked up 5. Then after writing the script, realized this video was going to be like 4 hours long and no one was gonna watch that. So I split it into 2. So there will be a part 2 coming in a couple months. With the other 2 myths plus another one I came up with. But we are going to address 3 today. These are things I've heard over and over and over again from spectators, the general public, other living historians even. But when I asked for documentation or why they thought that, they couldn't give me any primary documentation or even anywhere to look. They didn't know where they had heard it most of the time, or if it was just, oh, well, everybody knows that. And it's like, well, not everyone does know that. And if everybody knew that, there has to be some sort of documentation somewhere. And so we're going to just look at some things I've heard and see if they're true or untrue. So my number 1 myth I want to discuss is that it took so long to get dressed back then. This myth appears in several variations. Not just that it took so long to get dressed. Like, you may have spectators asking things like, well, how long did it take you to get dressed this morning? Or, I couldn't imagine having to get dressed and all that. It must have taken forever. Or, how early did you have to wake up this morning to get dressed and all that? Or, poor people wouldn't have worn all that. They wouldn't have had the time to do any of that. Or, romance authors who like to vastly exaggerate the process of getting dressed and undressed every single day for literary aesthetic? I don't know. Well, I highly doubt that anyone in the 19th century actually documented how long it took them to get dressed every day. Actually, one person did. I'm looking at the book right now. I have to go find the source. Excuse me, I have to research. Okay, no one ever would have documented that unless it was something that was unusual. And there is no way I'm going to be reading this whole book. I don't think I marked either. So, in Tenting on the Plains, which is Elizabeth Custer, so General George Armstrong Custer's wife, she followed him around. Women didn't usually follow their husbands into battle. That's something that men do, not women. But Elizabeth Custer would follow her husband places. And somewhere in here, she is wearing full women's clothing. Because he talks about leaving the bodice of her riding habit by a tree somewhere and they never get it back. She is the only woman aside from a free woman who is her servant going around. There is no way I'm going to be able to read all this today. I remember she jokes at one point with some of her husband's men, and she kind of boasts a little bit about how she can get dressed in the same amount of time that it takes her husband's men to get ready. So she's not the one holding them back in the morning, basically. And that's a source of pride for her. So that's something that would have been unusual, that she is able to get dressed in these layers in the same amount of time it took the soldiers to get ready. And I wish I had the page reference for you, but I know she says it. I have a computer in front of me. Is it on Google Books? Alright. Haha! Okay, this isn't exactly the quote I was thinking of, but found something similar. And actually, it actually mentions the time. I forgot this. I haven't read this book for like 5 years. So she says specifically, on this expedition, I had brought down the art of dressing in a hurry to so fine a point that I could take my bath and dress entirely in 7 minutes. My husband timed me one day without my knowledge, and I had the honor of this being added to a very brief list of my attributes as a soldier. Okay, that wasn't quite the one I was looking for, but that actually helps even better because we have a time now. Bathe and dress in 7 minutes. I love it when I sometimes think about these things while I'm doing, while I'm sitting here filming. Alright, I was going to say that although most people would probably have written about how long it took them to get dressed, it's something very easily to replicate, fortunately. But Mrs. Custer can bathe and dress in 7 minutes. Now that's probably a very good time, considering she's bragging about this. 7 minutes isn't bad. I can't bathe. I don't think I could bathe and dress in the 19th century in 7 minutes, but I'm the average woman. I have been doing this again for 13 years. I have a good bit of experience getting dressed up in, say, historical clothing. Therefore, I am very practiced at it. I can get dressed quickly, and again, I don't have to stop and think about, oh, what comes next. My brain automatically knows what comes next, and I can just put it on as if I'm getting dressed in my modern day clothes. But I think I can replicate this quite nicely. So let's get dressed and see how long it takes. For the sake of the video's length, I'm going to speed this up. But in the interest of fairness, we're going to try 3 different time frames. And I will put a timer on the video so you can see exactly how long it is taking me. So the 3 time periods we'll do is 1830, 1860, and 1880. And we're not going to go for anything extremely extravagant. We're not going to do like super upper class, bougie stuff. We're going to do average person, nice, respectable, not, farm labor, toiling in the fields, but let's go for like average working class woman living in town, seamstress. I'm a seamstress. Let's just say our person in each time period is a seamstress. Someone who is still very much working class, working for basically dirt. Seamstresses got paid next to nothing for all their work, but they still need to appear very respectable, fairly nicely dressed, simply because they were taking in clients, or even going to their clients' houses and staying there until the project was done and then leaving. So you still need to appear very respectable. So we're going to go for nice and respectably dressed. For continuity and fairness, I think we'll put on these same accessories for each time frame, namely a belt, a bonnet, and a parasol, although I don't wear belts with the 1880 stuff, so we'll substitute a watch. So let's start with the 1830s. I have on a shift. Next comes stockings, garters, and shoes. Corset next. This will take the longest because I have to lace it in the front and then switch it to the back. The other problem is this is going to be a slightly off time measurement because I'd forgotten that my corset last I wore it had been set under a candle during the night, and I went to bed early, and when I woke up the next morning my corset was caked in candle wax, which isn't great. So my laces are extremely caked up and they're very hard to get through the holes. So this is probably going to take me a little bit longer than it would normally, but we're going to keep going for it. We're going for 2 petticoats today, which yes, need to be starched to stand out better, but we're doing a getting dressed video, not a laundry demonstration. On top of the last petticoats should go pockets, but I forgot them. Then the dress. Pockets aren't absolutely necessary though. You didn't necessarily have to carry things around, so they're not super important, I suppose. The sleeve supports are already inside, as they would be. We're going to add a belt, a bonnet, a parasol, ready to go. Nice and respectable, not laboring the fields and not wealthy. Alright, that took me 10 minutes and 37 seconds, which will be the longest of our 3 times today, simply because of the corset issue. Now we're going to take it off, and the only reason I am doing this on camera is because I don't read historical romance, partially because historical romance authors don't know diddly squat about period dress. Even those who think they have researched really have no clue what it's like. Or I've read a blog of one who tried it on and was like, oh, it took me like an hour to get dressed. Honey, you haven't done it before. Of course it's gonna take you forever. Someone who's done it all the time isn't gonna take it that long. Yes, I have a pet peeve. So yes, we're gonna time how long it takes me to get undressed, because I need some romance author somewhere, somehow, to realize that what they're writing about ain't the truth. So, to get undressed, I don't know if you saw that time, but it was 1 minute and 31 seconds. That's it. Yes, the clothes are still in a pile on the floor. You asked me how long it took to get undressed, not how long it took to put everything away. And honestly, if you're a romance author, are we really spending time to put clothes away in those scenes? Also, a hint to romance authors. Notice the lack of underwear under that shift. There is nothing going on under that shift. Absolutely nothing. You don't have to take off any clothing to have romantic liaisons. You just gotta lift up the skirts and you're good. There are plenty of historical lithographs and drawings to illustrate this purpose that I'm not even sure I could put on screen. Let's just leave it as yes, there's primary documentation for it, and you can take my primary documentation. I'm a living historian married to another living historian. I have experience in such matters. No clothing has to be taken off. Let's move on to the 1860s. For the sake of being thorough, I am going to wear drawers, although I typically don't, just because they would be common under the crinolines. Stockings, garters, and shoes. Corset next. This one is super fast to put on. Then petticoat, hoop, and underskirt. Dress goes on. Notice how, as in the same as the 1830s, the dress is one piece and not separates. That's more typical. Again, adding a belt, bonnet, and parasol, done, and again, nice and respectable. Not wealthy, not a beggar. That took 6 minutes and 34 seconds. Now to take it off. And once again, drawers are split crotch, so there is really no need to take anything off if you don't want to. One minute and 24 seconds. And that's me not in a hurry. I have clocked myself at less than 30 seconds. If I'm highly motivated to get my clothes off, it can be done in less than 30 seconds. So for the next one, the 1880s, I've only worn the 1880s maybe half a dozen to a dozen times, so I'm not the most practiced. But there are fewer layers and they tend to go on a little faster, so I may not be the best person to say this is like an average time. And again, in any of these getting dressed videos, I'm not rushing. This is me getting dressed without rushing whatsoever. This is not a rushed, oh, I'm late, let's get out the door, frantically getting dressed. This is simply me getting dressed in the morning. So the 1880s, we start off with chemise and drawers. Combinations would be more common and less time because it's one less layer, but I don't like combinations. Stockings, garters, and shoes. And then corset, this one again is really fast. Petticoat, bustle, then underskirt. The dress is in two pieces and is directly copied from an original in my collection. The skirt is a bit weird, so it takes a bit. And a lot of buttons on that bodice. No belt this time. I added a watch and chain instead to addition to our bonnet and parasol. But even like not being practiced, my time was 6 minutes and 17 seconds, which ironically was the exact same amount of time it took me to do the 1860s. Now getting undressed is going to take a little bit longer because of that whole back situation. When my husband takes off my 1880s clothes, it goes off like that fast. That's because he doesn't have to like turn it around and mess with all those fiddly bits in the back. So even without much practice, it does not take you hours to get undressed and undressed in the 19th century. If it's taking you more than 10 minutes, you're either not doing it correctly, trying to put on clothes that don't fit you, aren't used to doing it, are doing something super extravagant where you need to do a lot of fiddly work in getting your dress on, or in the case of the 1830s, having to deal with wax-crusted corset laces that wouldn't go through the holes. I don't recommend that. And it's not a bad thing to be out of practice or not practiced at all. We just don't need to be taking people who are doing that and touting this as, oh, look how long it took them to get dressed. Of course, they're not used to it. So in 300 years from now, putting on our clothes, it's going to take them longer than a few minutes to do it too, because they're going to look at it and go, wait, how does this bra go on? Does it go on this way? Does it go on that way? How do you, it poses in the back. How do you do this? Oh, you got to turn to the front. Like, it's going to take them a little bit longer. They're not used to it. It's the same thing. When you're accustomed to doing it, it shouldn't take you very long. So myth busted. Let's move on. So the next myth I want to bust is the myth of only rich people dressed like this, because poor people couldn't afford to or didn't have the time to do this. Obviously the time one is fake. We already debunked that. This also shows up in people saying, oh, you had to have ladies' maids to get dressed like this because you couldn't dress in all those layers by yourself. You can't put a corset on by yourself. You can't get in a hoop skirt by yourself. Clearly, as we just saw, that is not true. In none of those clips did I need a husband or a lady's maid to help me get dressed. I can do it 100% myself. The only time I need help getting into my 19th century clothing is if I have a back closing bodice. And the only reason I need help, because I know people who can do it by themselves. I can't. I have short little T-Rex arms. I don't know if you can actually tell. My arms are about 2 to 3 inches shorter than the average person of my height. So any type of clothing that I wear, my sleeves are always super, super long. I have to actually take up every single one of my sleeves because I have short arms. That's just a me issue. So I can't actually reach back there to do much of anything. So yeah, I have to have help getting dressed in back closing bodices. And a lot of people did have help getting into back closing bodices. But I've seen people who are able to do it themselves. So it is possible. So all that to say, that part is clearly false. You don't need to have ladies' maids. It does not take a ridiculous amount of time. Those are both very false statements, as we've already seen. But did poor people really wear all those layers? So it does somewhat depend on your definition of being poor. And of course, not everyone in the 19th century was wearing all the layers because there are people groups who are still being dressed in traditional for them clothing, and they're not going to be wearing things like this. But in the Western culture, yes, the vast majority of people are wearing them. Even extremely poor people are wearing corsets and petticoats and chemises and all of that. So it's not a one-size-fits-all question, but we do have to understand that each and every one of those layers serves a purpose. So yes, the farm wife toiling in the fields in a drought to prepare for the next harvest is going to be wearing the same layers as an heiress who has her patterns taken in New Orleans, then shipped off to France to be made directly in the latest fashions and then sent back to her ready-made. Those are going to be wearing the same amount of clothing. Their clothes are going to look vastly different. There are going to be different fabrics, different trims, different styles even, but they're going to have the same layers. And again, to understand that, you have to understand that each layer has a purpose. A chemise is meant to take sweat and body oils from the rest of your clothing. It gets dirty and nasty and gross. You wash it very frequently because they're easy to launder. They're white. They can be bleached or blued. Super easy, and they're easy to replace because it's cheap fabric. And it keeps the rest of your garments from lasting a whole lot longer. It catches all the sweat so that your body odor doesn't catch onto your dress as often. I have chickens going onto the road. Give me a moment. So the chemise is something you would change very frequently. Usually every day you would get a fresh one. If it's super hot and nasty, you may change one a couple times a day. Drawers are the same way. They're considered body linens, things that go against your body. They're meant to be worn very frequently. very often and usually have a lot of them. From trousseau lists suggested by ladies magazines, which ladies magazines I've discussed in other videos are meant to be mostly for working class people, not for the upper class as we assume, down to books on making your own clothes, body linen such as chemises and drawers are usually mentioned by the dozen. Not by the singular garment, but they're saying for a dozen you'll need such and such amount of fabric. So of our readership, a bride is usually taking so many dozens into a marriage, that sort of thing. So the Young Ladies Journal in 1867 answered a correspondent asking, what should be in a lady's trousseau, and they responded with a dozen each of chemises and drawers, a dozen each of chemises, drawers, and nightdresses, 6 flannel petticoats, 6 white petticoats, 1 or 2 colored petticoats, a dozen pair of stockings, a dozen pocket handkerchiefs are necessary, and it says the outer garments must be consistent with the lady's position. Now, a dozen to us seems like a lot, but let's contrast that to someone who is very wealthy and what their trousseau looks like. This is a trousseau from an extremely wealthy woman in 1837. It is told by the Ladies Magazine and Museum. Now, in the words of the magazine itself, it says, "You will say this is a very rich trousseau, but you are aware of there being persons of immense fortune. These sound like people that Mrs. Bennet would gladly marry all her daughters to. It's meant to be extravagant." So I won't read all of it. It is extensive. But it includes 6 dozen chemises, along with 2 dozen more chemises with frills specifically to go under riding habits, 24 petticoats with pointed waistbands, 24 plain petticoats, 8 dozen cotton stockings, 2 dozen silk stockings, 8 dozen handkerchiefs, 4 dozen nightdresses. It also contained 14 dresses, so we're clear. So now we know what the basic woman was wearing in underwear, so about a dozen. We also know what an extremely wealthy woman was bringing into a marriage. 6 dozen. What about the poorest of the poor? So more than once I saw references to poor people not having half a dozen chemises to their name or having only half a dozen chemises to their name. This seems to only apply to free people because more than once I saw enslaved people only being allotted 2 chemises a year. Now those who were living in poor houses or relying on charity sometimes did only have the clothes on their backs, and we'll talk about one such case in a moment. Now on to corsets or stays, often used interchangeably in the period. Corsets gave back support, bust support, they smoothed out the torso so you could have a close-fitting bodice. So yes, working women and poor women were still wearing them. Not 100% of people were, but the vast majority of free women in the Western culture were. And I say free because I'm not extremely well researched into enslaved women, so I don't know what their clothing allotments were, and I don't know whether stays were a normal part of that or not. But even poor homeless women were wearing corsets. We're going to talk about the case of Harriet Balcott, as recorded in parliamentary papers in the year 1846. Harriet is a young woman who, out of wedlock, has had a child and she's pregnant with a second. She's admitted to a workhouse called a poorhouse, and she gives birth. She has no clothes for the baby. She says she has them at her mother's, but the matron of the workhouse won't let her go unless she has clothes for the baby. And so she cuts up her own nightgown, flannel petticoat, and nightcap to make clothes for the baby, and she's permitted to leave. It is recorded she then dressed herself in the remainder of her clothes, which consisted of a cotton chemise, stays, a cotton petticoat with a body to it, a gown, stocking, shoes, and bonnet, all in good condition. A petticoat with a body to it just means that it looks like a dress, so it has a bodice to it, it's attached. I'll put a picture of one from the John Bright collection on the screen for you. It's still a petticoat, they just had a body to it. So it's almost like having a corset cover and a petticoat attached. Although corset covers weren't common in this time period, they became more common in the later 19th century, and they weren't even called corset covers yet, they're called petticoat bodies. So when they're separate from the petticoat, they're still called petticoat bodies, even into the 1860s where you start seeing the term corset cover. But yes, this homeless woman in a workhouse is still wearing stays. Apparently she didn't own any other changes of clothing, but she owned and wore stays. This woman, by the way, is being written about because of infanticide. When she leaves the workhouse, she takes that poor baby, she strips it naked, puts it in a hedge, leaves it to die, and goes off to her mother's. She is not a nice woman. Otherwise, it takes a quick look through advertisements of the time period to see corsets that are specifically being marketed to working women or to maids. Even some stays being specifically called common cheap stays, as was the case in modern stays that are being illustrated 1868's The Corset and the Crinoline. And besides, as someone who gets to play in the 19th century, I find corsetry to be far more helpful in the working classes than I do in upper, simply because of the back support when doing labor. Proper mid-19th century corsetry should not impede your movement. I've butchered chickens, scrubbed floors on my hands and knees, chased after small children, cooked over hearth stoves and open fires, served meals, made beds, fed animals, gardened, maintained a household, ridden horses, hiked, been chased by Comanches, done laundry, the period way, fetched water with yokes and buckets, and even climbed trees, all properly corseted. A period corset should only support and assist you, not impede you in any way. Except for bending at the waist, you won't be able to do that, but you learn to bend at the knees instead. At least one petticoat would be worn, if not two or more, but in the working class situations, you do see two being most common. Often in working class situations, the topmost petticoat is going to be some sort of colored fabric, whether that be a wool or just an old dress skirt, which could be a wool dress skirt or a cotton dress skirt. Of course, your petticoats are a little bit shorter than your dress, and then working women would often pull up their skirts, either tuck them into a waistband of an apron or like tie them or pin them back. And that way you have more range of movement on your feet because your skirts are now shorter. It protects your dress skirt, which is often the most expensive part of your dress. And you want it to last long. It's going to keep it from getting stained and dirty, all that. And so you wear your petticoat most often. And I cannot tell you how many original paintings I've seen where working women have their skirts pinned up. It is an extremely common thing to see working class in the 19th century. And honestly, you don't see it enough in working class living historians. It's something that I do all the time. Anytime I'm doing any type of work, I have my skirts pinned up. And I get people, I ask questions about it, but it's one of those things, it is so common to see illustrations of it that yes, that's what I do. So just for fun, although we've kind of already debunked this myth, I'm going to show you me getting dressed again with all the same undergarments, except this time we're going to do very working class. So like farm laborer type dressing. Just so you can see the difference between, you know, respectably dressed, may not even be middle class, they still may be working class, but nice and respectably dressed, as opposed to like, I'm in the fields plowing today. Just could kind of see the difference. So starting with the 1830s. All the same underpinnings, except this time I'm choosing to wear a wool petticoat on top instead of the white one. I'm remembering my pockets this time. I may be poor, but I still carry things. I'm choosing a wool dress for no other reason other than it was available. Sleeve supports are optional for work, but in the case of plowing a field, I likely wouldn't be wearing them. I'm wearing a neckerchief to fill in the neckline to keep from sunburning, an apron to protect my dress, and also a bonnet. I could also wear a sunbonnet, those are a thing, but I don't really have a good 1830s sunbonnet yet, so my plain straw bonnet is going to work in the situation. Now 1860s. Same underpinnings except for no crinoline this time. I'm going to wear the same wool petticoat instead. This is a very simple wool cotton. This is a very simple cotton dress. Finished with a neckerchief at the neck. And again, a sunbonnet. 1880s is a little bit difficult for me because it's a time period I don't do very often, and I don't ever do working class, so we're kind of have to play at this a little bit. So I may not wear the full lobster tail while working, but I'm still going to wear some sort of pad back there, so I'll just do a bustle pad. So I'll choose a simple bustle pad, and again a wool petticoat. This one is an older 1860s skirt that I just remade over, so it even still has a pocket inside of it. I work a lot around fires. I work a lot around fire, so having a wool petticoat for me is a must. Wool doesn't catch fire, it smolders, and sometimes it doesn't catch at all. So it's very nice to have around a fire because you're not going to go up in flame. Putting on an apron, and I actually don't have an 1880s sunbonnet, so we're just going to leave it like this, but that's basically the 1880s. Same underpinnings, different professions for each of our time periods. So for plowing the fields, taking on clients, we're still wearing the same underpinnings, they just look a little different. Myth busted, and let's move on to myth number 3. The third and final myth we're going to talk about today is the myth of 2 dresses. It's the myth that started this whole video. Who here has heard women only own 2 dresses? Sometimes it's 3 dresses, sometimes I say 3. 1 dress for work and 1 to go into town and do shopping. Sometimes it's 2 for work and 1 to go out and 1 nice dress. Oh, have I? Again, this is the comment that started this whole video. I don't remember when I heard this first, but I remember thinking it sounded off and something that people would just make up, essentially. And no one has ever been able to provide me documentation for this. Now, this was really hard to research. Sometimes we get fortunate and people like write out their list of how much clothing they own. In fact, particularly we're going to talk about one diary in a little bit. But for this, you kind of have to go to like probate records, court records, dying, and like listing out what's in their property. And then things like runaway ads in terms of clothing. And that gives us kind of an idea what the average wardrobe would be for a working class person. We're going to speak mostly on working class people. I am going to give you a few examples of very wealthy people and see how it contrasts. For this, we're kind of see how many dresses a year are people getting. And that's going to lead into a whole nother video where we talk about how long these dresses are lasting, which may make the number higher, because even if they're only getting so many a year, how long are those actually lasting is a whole different story. So we're going to get into that to the next video. So most of what we do have is, of course, centered around the wealthier women, such as the trousseau from earlier. In 1854, there is a book called Handbook to India, which had a packing list for women who, again, are mostly wealthier, traveling to India for pleasure or for politics or military or whatever. Again, generally wealthier women, and it gives them packing lists of what to bring on their journey. And it specifically says that the dress list is only for the journey itself because of the harsh conditions of the ships and such. The dresses aren't lasting longer than the journey. So it specifically says you're going to need a whole new wardrobe once you get to India. But for the journey itself, what you will need: 4 printed morning dresses, a black silk dress for dinner, a slight colored silk or any cheap material for a dress for Sunday. So basically 6 dresses just from the journey to England to India. But what about poorer people? So in A Cotton Kingdom, A Traveler's Observations on Cotton and Slavery in the American Slave States, which is published in 1861, it's mentioned that at least on one plantation that the average quantities of clothing allowance includes 2 summer outfits a year, 2 winter outfits a year, plus a calico dress at Christmas, and that a lot of the enslaved individuals are also purchasing dress lengths of fabric for themselves. So that's 5 sets of clothing per year for an enslaved individual, who are, by definition, the poorest of the poor. So you'd think that the average free person would probably have at least that many, if not more. At the very least, it hits a pretty big nail in the coffin of they only own 2 dresses. So let's talk about one of my favorite 19th century people, Mrs. Carey Williams. Mrs. Williams kept a diary primarily in the last part of 1858 all the way through 1859. Mrs. Williams is a young married woman who lives in a Sierra mining town. She has a husband, a young child, and they live with her in-laws. She read Godey's Ladies' Book, favored women's suffrage, and was deeply religious. Being full-time miners post-gold rush, they weren't exactly the wealthiest people monetary-wise. In fact, at one point in time, they even had to sell off their piano at a great loss. They bought the piano for $250, they sell it for $150 just to have some cash. They are, however, slightly higher on the social standing than you would think given their financial situation. They go to balls and parties, so they are higher up on the social ladder. They just don't have any funds to back it up. Carey frequently purchases second-hand markets and peddlers. In fact, she has a debt to the peddler that she has to pay off a couple of times. And they go through an amazing amount of shoes as a family. I'm not kidding. Every couple of weeks, even every couple of entries, they're purchasing shoes for one or another member of the family. They go through so many shoes. Fortunately for us, Carey was an avid seamstress in the sense that she liked to write down exactly what she sewed on each and every day, which is wonderful. She sewed a lot of things for her husband and her young toddler son. This kid goes through a lot of aprons. I swear he has like 2 dozen. Every couple of entries she's writing, oh, cut out 3 more aprons for Walla. And I'm like, what on earth is this child doing to his aprons? And I haven't made a full inventory of the garments that she makes and remakes and cuts out and remakes over again. But I did skim back through and I made a list of all the garments she sews for herself. Or in case of one dress, pays a seamstress to make for her. So just in the last 3 months of 1858 and most of 1859, here's a complete list of the garments that she sews or works on for herself. This is not the articles of clothing she was already wearing prior to working on all these other things. So she has more outfits, but these are just the ones that she mentioned specifically working on. So she makes herself a purple calico apron. She finishes another apron that is not described. She has a cashmere dress that she actually has the local seamstress, Miss Gibson, come over to help her with. So Miss Gibson comes over, and again, seamstresses will either take the cloth to their office or their home, work on it, and then just bring it back. Or in some cases, they would come to their client's house, stay there until the project is finished, and then go back home, which is what Miss Gibson did. So for the cashmere dress, Miss Gibson came over, she cut and made the bodice and sleeves. Carey made the skirt, which saved her money, because Miss Gibson wasn't having to make the whole dress, but the skirt's the easiest part. There's no fitting, there's no fiddly bits, it's just straight seams, and a lot of it you don't even have to have nice stitches with to make the skirt. So Carrie makes herself the skirt to save money. Miss Gibson makes the bodice and the more difficult fiddly bits. That dress, by the way, was done in 2 days. Miss Gibson gets there on a Friday, they work, and by Saturday the 11th, the dress is done and Carrie says it fits beautifully. Also, no sewing machine is ever mentioned, which is another really fun myth that you hear of, oh, everything was hand sewn back then and it took months to get done. I have hand sewn entire dresses using Puree techniques in less than 5 days, only working on it for 2 hours a day. That is not true. That may be another myth we get into at some point in time. And this would be a really good example of how it does not take months to get a dress done. Moving back to Carrie, she has a bonnet that she starches, which I'm assuming is a sun bonnet, and later on she does mention that she starches her sun bonnet. So I don't know if that's the same bonnet or if it's a different one. I'm assuming it's the same one. She rips up and then recuts and makes a green plaid dress. There's a white bonnet that she wears with the cashmere dress. She has a merino dress, a marine hooped skirt, which I think is a lot like a crinoline. I think she was making her own crinoline just based on the materials. I don't know what was going on with that. She bought a nice dress cap for 50 cents at the local peddler. She has a headdress of pink chenille with satin beads. She buys a pink lute string for a sash. She's a ball dress of Swiss with a double skirt and puff sleeves that is trimmed with lace and a rose-colored silk ribbon. She has a white dress. She has a green watered silk parasol that broke on the first use. She had bought it from the peddler. She takes it back to the peddler. He exchanges it. The first parasol had fringe. The second one has a ruffle. It's also green silk. She has a merino scarf. She has a plaid muslin dress that she made over into a wrapper. She has a remade red calico dress. And this one she specifically says she used to wear last winter. Hasn't worn it, but now she's remaking it. And 2 more wrappers that she makes up at the same time. So just from that list, she has 7 dresses and 3 wrappers. Not including the dresses she was already wearing before she worked on all of these. And that's just in 1 year. She obviously wasn't sewing on these naked or underpinnings. She's not a living historian. We can get away with that. They couldn't in the 19th century. So she clearly has other dresses as well. These are only for her. And again, they are not rich people. Carrie does not keep a servant. She does her own laundry, which in the 19th century, if you came into any sort of money, the first household chore you are sending out is laundry. It is a hard task. It takes up at least a day every single week. You are sending that out to a laundress the second you can. And she does her own, so they clearly don't have a lot of funds to spare. And again, this is rural California pre-Civil War. She has no help at home and only 1 dress is partially made by a seamstress. Everything else she worked on her own. And again, she does her own laundry. Actually, once a week she does laundry, except for a couple times she felt so sick she wasn't able to get to laundry, so the next week she had to do 2 weeks worth of laundry. She mentions that. They are somewhat higher in the social circle. We tend to equate money with class nowadays. That's not necessarily how things worked back then. Which that could be a whole nother myth-busting video, is classism in the 19th century and how to distinguish class. That's a very muddled situation with a lot of assumptions that we make nowadays based on our own class system that would not have been anything they would have recognized. I didn't specifically mention any of the other, or I didn't specifically count any of the other dresses that Carrie mentions for other people, but it doesn't seem like she has an exorbitant amount of clothes based on what she wrote about her mother-in-law and the 2 other younger ladies that she sometimes sews with. I think they're somehow related. And then based on other people in the town, it doesn't seem like she has a ridiculous amount of dresses. It just seems like she has a normal wardrobe. And that's a far cry from the 2 dress myth. And so Carrie's is the only diary I have found with such extensive mentions of wardrobe. If you know of another one, I would love to hear it. Whether it's something I could purchase to read myself, or if I can find it on Google Books. If you know of one, I would love to hear it, because I would like to see how, because this is one time stamp. Yes, it's rural California in 1858 and 59. I would like to see how the same things, like in 1858 and 1859, were different for someone who lived in New York, or in Texas, or in Georgia. And then, different time periods. What does it look like is that similar to 1825? Is it similar in 1889? I would like just to have more information on this, but definitely for someone who is a little bit of a higher social class but with no money, having at least 10 outfits, I think we can say for now that the myth of 2 dresses is busted. And that about wraps up today's video on myth busting. Have you ever heard any of these myths? Are there any myths that get under your skin that you've heard? Let me know in the comments. I think most historians probably have a pet peeve mystery myth that they've heard over and over again that really gets under their skin, and I'd like to hear yours. If you stuck around to the end of the video, thank you so much for doing so. I know it was a long one. For those of you who are new here, my sewing videos end up being about a little less than 20 minutes long. My getting dressed videos tend to be less than 10 minutes. As you've seen, it doesn't take me that long to get dressed. So this is a much longer video than I typically do, but I've quite enjoyed it. I enjoyed being able to sit here and just chat one-on-one with, it seems like, a friend, and share some research, drink some tea, have a nice relaxing day. So I've actually really enjoyed this style video, and if you did as well, please let me know in the comments because I'd love to do this again. Like, I really enjoyed like delving into like a couple of topics, really researching them, finding some really great tidbits of information, because every time you research something, and you historians know, every time you research something, you always find something else that leads to another research project, and it's like, oh, I didn't know that, or oh, I want to read more about that. So you end up getting so much more information than you bargained for, and I love that. It's like a little puzzle or game. And then I get to sit here like in my library, my little mending corner with my little samplers on the wall, and sit here and have a nice little chat. So this has been really nice. And I know this is a topic we won't be running out of content anytime soon. History myths are about as common as syphilis in a tavern. And I don't think I'll ever be upset about sitting down just having to dispel some myths. I actually quite enjoy this. And we don't even have to do dress myths next time. Like, we can branch out. We can do things like social norms or undergarments or class structures, which I know I mentioned my pet peeve about class structures before. I'd be real happy to do that one for y'all because I'm real tired of living historians saying, oh, I'm a middle class. And I think everyone thinks they're middle class. And it's like, no, you are not. Most of you are working class. There's a difference. Now, you could be upper working class. You don't have to be like lower working class, but you might not be middle class. Or my favorite is when people say, oh, I'm a farmer, so I'm poor. And I'm like, yeah, you could be. You also could be like the Gross family from Hempstead, Texas, who owned 70,000 acres, several hundred enslaved people, were the wealthiest people in Texas for a while in the early 1850s, and were still listed in the census as farmers. So no, just because you're a farmer does not mean you're poor. Have a little bit more to your backstory, please. Again, can you tell I have a pet peeve about class structures? I know people in the comments will be asking me to dispel corset myths, which there's a lot of videos on, but I still keep seeing misinformation being spread. So maybe we do need to do something, and maybe go beyond the normal ones. Like there are people who do the rib removal theory, which is completely false, and other corset myths. Maybe we need to do something beyond rib removal and fainting. Although, you know what, I probably should do the fainting one, because I actually, at least in high school and middle school, I had a lot of issues with fainting. I would faint. I fainted from getting the flu. I fainted from putting an earring in. It's a family trait. It's fine. I've learned my triggers now. I haven't fainted in a while. Gotten close a couple times. I haven't actually fainted. But I've never fainted in a corset. And you would think that if putting on a corset caused you to pass out, someone who faints from putting earrings in would probably faint from putting on a corset, and I haven't. So I'd probably be a good person to talk about that. Maybe that one should go on the list. I'm basically a fainting goat in human form, so I'd be the person to talk about that one. And I've tight-laced myself before for situations when I was younger and a little bit more vain. So if tight-lacing or just putting on a corset caused you to faint, I would be the first person to, but I have not. So that is most definitely a myth, but I'd be happy to talk about it. And of course, there's always more dress myths. As I said before, this video started out as 5 myths. It's gotten bumped down to 3. There'll be 3 more in the next one coming out in a couple months. So we'll do that one, and after that we can discuss some other types of myths that people have heard and would like to be debunked. If you have a myth and then you have a soapbox and you say, this is a myth because, and here's this source, please let me know. I would love to share that. That'd be awesome if you would share some sources with me to get me started. And with all that being said, thank you so much for joining me today as we dispelled some Victorian dress myths. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and click that little bell notification so you're notified anytime I upload a new video. And if you really like the content I put out, consider joining the channel to help support me in the work that I do, as well as get a few extra perks. And as always, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next one.